Please help me welcome Mutendei Nabutete.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here. Definitely excited to be here, and I hope I'll be able to share some um, knowledge that's beneficial to you and helps you in your writing process. So I'll try to go through what I have. You can always, Jameel, if I move too fast or something's not clear, interrupt me and I can always rewind. So what I'm covering today is historical context and character development. And I will start off with historical context, just because there's a lot of body to that. So the first question I want to ask then is, to best approach this, is what is history from a narrative storytelling perspective? And from my own experiences, when you look at history in a cultural lens, it can be summed up by the word tradition, which is what's carried forward between successive generations. Now, with tradition in mind, there is a tug of war between traditional communal memory on one side and individual backstory on the others. So when you're looking at traditional cultural history, it tends to lean more to fact, while the individual backstory, which is the lore of a character, tends to lead more to fiction. So you'll never hear someone talking about the legend of, so you will hear people talk about the legend of Hercules, the legend of Samson, but they won't say the lore of Hercules or Samson, as opposed to someone like a character like Dracula. They will say the lore of Dracula, right? So that's where this distinction between legend and lore comes in on the basis of fact. Now, that's not to say that there is no fictionalization in history, because as you may be aware, a lie told for 2 generations becomes the truth. Okay, so when we look at history in a context of writing, it requires us to evaluate our own history. Okay, and how do we do this? So from a context standpoint, I've always learned there's 3 ways to look at history. So you have, firstly, the alternate reality of history, fictional history, and missing history. Now, some of these will overlap in some areas. Okay, so going backwards again, I want to start with missing history. Okay, as this is where there's the largest room for creative opportunity and exploration, which is also closely related to alternate history in addressing what is currently the Eurocentric fixation in media that's existed over the past century. So what's missing is basically the history that people don't see. That's outside of the Anglo-centric narrative, okay? And this has given rise to things like Afrofuturism, Black science fiction, and fantasy. So you have this represented by shows like Black Panther, See You Yesterday, The Color of Light, Raising Dion, Black Lightning, and several other shows, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, while not dismissing their value, these films, they lack a real world historical reference, and they don't address what's missing from a historical perspective. So that's where the context comes in. Now, if you consider Africa's greatest warriors and how they've been portrayed in modern media, we have characters like Queen Nzinga, Shaka Zulu, and others who have really not been done justice by Western media and Eurocentric representation. One particular case to note is Queen Nandi, who's Shaka Zulu's mother. In the Shaka Zulu TV series, she was, for lack of a better word, portrayed in a kind of harlot manner, which Harold Rosen of the LA Times in his article, as well as the local Kenyan writer Alex Ndirito, have both dissected and lambasted. And I will share links to those 2 articles to further exemplify them. Now, while Africans and Blacks have suffered greatly from underrepresentation and misrepresentation, the community that has been the ultimate victims of the enforced periphery, which Eurocentrism has created, has been the First Nations or Native American community, whether you're in Canada or America, they have different terms. Right? So Hollywood is not given a free, creative, and authentic lens to Native American culture and deities in their own element. I have never seen tales of Native American cultural legends like the fraternal deities Tehipin and their brother Kwati. We're 3 seasons deep into American Gods, and none of them have been shown in any dominant role. Right? Now, on the other side, we have many personable stories that exist, like Half-Breed, which is the captivating autobiography of Maria Campbell, which gives insight into the experiences and tribulations that women pioneers within the First Nations communities, and by extension, Native Americans in USA have experienced. And she's had a very rich history that should be right there alongside other Black and African American icons like Rosa Parks and several others. So this provides an opportunity for more research to further your own historical context. Now, if you want to really get a sense of the magnitude of how ingrained the periphery agenda Eurocentrism is, it extends into the Bible. So if you're a Bible scholar or just familiar with the Christian religion, you have heard of Queen Makena, the African Ethiopian queen. However, she only appears relevantly in the Bible when she goes to visit King Solomon. And her claim to fame, as is portrayed in the Bible, is that she visits Solomon and they may or may not have had sexual relations. She may not have been his wife or his consort or concubine. No question is asked about her life before and her life after she encounters Solomon. So there's that big missing gap. And that's some of the things I try to cover with my novel, Shadow Walkers. Okay. Now, the same can be asked of what's missing in the North American experience for writers of color. And what I will be putting out is from my own experiences, so it may not reconcile with your experiences or everyone in the room. So I just want to put that out there as I'm using it as an analytical tool. So wrongful portrayals have only dealt with a small circle of people and happenings around the titular character. So, for example, Shaka Zulu, the portrayal of Bumpy Johnson in Hoodlum, and several other characters. Now, this particular discrepancy is, for me, what made Alex Haley's novel Roots so great, and its particular cultural focus. Now, what separates it from other works of art, not devaluating them, is at the time it was written, and again, this is from my own experiences, the Black American mindset did not have a cultural connection to Africa and the motherland. So what Alex Haley achieved is he created a cultural lens. Okay, so outside of Western influence, through his book, which has been debated as being fact or fiction, it provided an unobstructive, unfiltered, and uninfringed upon recollection of how life was or would have been for the masses of Black Americans anthropologically, if they remained in Africa and not been victims of the slave trade and the mind wipe and the cultural heritage they were stripped of. Okay? So he was able to connect through tales told to him by his grandmother, his genetic heritage all the way back to Jufri and Jufri in Gambia, okay? Centering on rites of passage, birth, adolescence, familial relations, the fabric and structure of an African community outside the influence of capitalism. He also focused on manhood training and initiation into adulthood and how a specific individual would fit into the community. It then moved on from that cultural heritage to focus on the magnitude of cultural loss and the depth of victimization of Black Americans, which is too easily dismissed with indifference in reference to the Jewish Holocaust, for example, because everyone says forget about slavery, but they never applied the same measure to the Jewish Holocaust. Okay. From a political standpoint, at a time when unification between Africans and Black Americans should have been a foregone conclusion, but we had the conflicting paradigms of Pan-Africanism and Black resistance, which kind of headbutted or stood in each other's way, save for the writer Marcus Garvey. This piece of work kind of provided a bridge around that. So being a fantastic book, it sold over 8.5 million copies, was translated into 26 languages. Now, on the female side, if you consider the piece of work by Jane M. All, the Mammoth Hunter series, talks about a presumably Eurocentric white lady in a prehistoric setting who's journeying through the world. No such tale has been written about the African woman journeying from one side of the continent to the other, or how there are bridges between communities as well. Because in Africa, as well as the early post-slavery period, there was a lot of intermarriages between different tribes, different communities, based on the character and value of the community. And that itself is a unique journey that has not really been addressed in the same measure in fiction and historical representation. Okay. Now, taking this to a larger scale, when we look at what's missing from the individual and cultural standpoint, we also have to do the same thing for missing in mythological civilizations and counter misrepresentation. So everyone may have heard of Atlantis, but I'm sure many people have not heard of High Brazil, the legendary phantom island of Ireland, which is supposed to be the home of their gods, and so on. Now, circling back to Atlantis, Atlantis has always been assumed to have a Eurocentric origin, but with research that's highly unlikely the case. Now, I won't go into too much detail, as I want to encourage the guests and my co-hosts to research this themselves. So I'm going to list a couple of things that I'll encourage everyone to research. The first one is the Rikat structure, known as the Eye of the Sahara. Then the first ancient king of Mauritania, Atlantis' description by Plato through his dialogues, and then something called the Herodotus map of the world. Okay. Now these are all, the Rikat structure is an existing at this moment physical structure. The other things that I've mentioned have been drawn from Herodotus and Plato's records through communication with Egypt. Now we also have to consider that the library in Egypt, Alexandria, was sacked. So at this point, there's no way to really ascertain what we've lost. Okay? So I will post these links when I can in the group, and to all the people who have attended, I will send the full presentation I have by email as well through Stacey. So perfect. With having discussed, sorry?
No, go ahead.
Okay. With having discussed what's missing, let me now jump back to alternate history and the fictionalization of current history, which are both two powerful and intertwined tools for changing a narrative to development without external influence. So alternate history is centered on what could have been, whether it's bad or good, the best or worst of situations. And this is developed in the real world setting of the story environment of choice. So the actual environment will stay the same, but the chronological events and their outcome may completely change. A couple key examples are the Watchmen movie and TV series, Black Panther and the upcoming Wakanda series, as well as the Inglourious Bastards movie by Quentin Tarantino, Brad Pitt, and Eli Roth. Now, when we look at alternate history applied today, it's also been used to kind of pull the wool over our eyes with every movie or narrative. For example, Ancient Aliens, which is very insulting to non-European civilizations before colonialism. There's a big assumption for Egyptian, Mayan, or Persian civilizations that they were built by aliens, but the show Ancient Aliens Debunked actually proves that Ancient Aliens is a fallacy, and it shows scientifically how these things were actually accomplished. You can find more references and more debunking videos on YouTube and Google just through simple searches. So this is a classic representation of the cultural dehumanization and a systematic agenda of degradation to accommodate physical and cultural genocide targeted against non-white, non-Western civilizations who achieved a great many cultural things of their own merit. Now, to counter this alternate history, Um, the existing Eurocentric environment must be also approached from the flip side of the coin. Okay, so we need to also focus on the perspective of unseen narratives, both for Eurocentric stories as well as African stories. One example is the fall of Rome and the fall of Greece. We never see those conceptualized. We also do not see any narratives around Africa's pre-colonial civilizations fighting against each other. For example, the founding of the first ancient kingdom of Mali, it was done by Sundiata Keita, who was a rebel leader whose own family had been historically deposed from their kingdom. Okay, we never speak about ancient Egypt's encounter with the mysterious sea people who they tried to conquer but couldn't. So while I was doing research, I came across the lost Carhide Legion of Roman soldiers. So after the defeat of Marcus Crassus, if you watch Spartacus, he's one of the central characters. He was defeated in battle, and his legions were captured, sent into exile in ancient China and Mongolia, where they became mercenaries. So this is a story that's never told. Now, in closing, in pursuing the value of alternative history, it will make you explore more and regard narratives outside of your own community with a different lens, providing perspectives beyond your own scope of knowledge. So that's one of the benefits of it. Now, when it comes to fictional history, it is based on real life events, but with a fictional element. So for example, X-Men First Class, where it incorporates the Cuban Missile Crisis, The Man in the Iron Mask, which is a fantastic movie with Gerard Depardieu and a bunch of other French actors. We have Hunters by Al Pacino, the series, and then most recently One Night in Miami, where Regina King creates a fictional meeting between four icons, Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, and his name has escaped me, Malcolm X, and the musician whose name has escaped me, but it'll come back to me. Okay? This allows us to apply a what if factor, right? And within the what if factor, we can weigh the pros and cons of any outcome, the goods and bad, the ups and downs, the good and bad of any society, any culture, and so on. It also makes society re-examine itself with the what if the foot was on the other shoe scenario. So for example, the portrayal of the Joker by the late Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, he kind of critiques society and makes it examine themselves with his famous outtake. Their morals, their code is a bad joke, dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. You'll see, I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other and they'll turn on each other. So I'm not the monster, I'm just ahead of the curve. Now then, if you examine America, which purports itself as the leader of the free world and the country of law and order, democracy, you have to take a step back and look at the hypocrisy that Trump, with his insurrection at the Capitol, has exposed. He's laid the racial undertones of America bare for everyone to see. So it's no longer a dirty secret. You look at voter suppression by Republicans, police brutality. Al Pacino's Hunters portrays this now on a personal level, where he is a Nazi hunter vigilante, but secretly, and sorry if I spoil this for anyone, but secretly he's also a Nazi in hiding himself. And this is once again an indictment of America, who through Operation Paperclip hid Nazis, incorporated them into their space program, and then the weapons development. Then Captain America, the Winter Soldier, kind of fictionalizes this, but it is based on a historical undertaking that's swept under the rug. Now, speaking of the shoe on the other foot, we always have to examine what we would do if we were in someone else's position. So Noughts and Crosses, which is a fantastic series, explores how the world will be if Africa actually colonized Europe and the Americas. And then we have the movie Krakow, where a white supremacist is transported into a world where blacks are supremacists and they've been meting out the same kind of violence against whites, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are good for re-examining ourselves and evaluate our humanity. So that's where I will end on historical context. Is there anything that wasn't clear or anything that I need to revisit?
That sounds pretty good. I think you clarified it for me, but I do have a question that I would like to present in terms of, in response to the historical representation.
Okay.
Before you switch over to character development, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right, cool. So in response to historical representation, where must a writer start to begin their historical journey so they can incorporate their findings in their creative writing process?
Okay, I would always say that there's no place at home. Like any culture, as I pointed out, has an untold story. So the best place is to start with your own backyard, because that's what you're comfortable with in your own skin, and you can most accurately portray before you venture out into other territories. Now, the benefit of that is, first of all, you'll be given you personally will be giving an objective view, and through conversations like this, you can then get a view of the other side, like how people will view you. One show that really does this is the Indian series on Netflix. Sorry, not a series, but the Indian movie on Netflix called White Tiger. Okay, so no one ever really talks about the caste system in India, even though it's very prevalent and very damaging um, and very stringent economically. And this White Tiger again lays it all bare. He's speaking from his own experiences, which he writes about in the novel, and provides the authentic background for his story. And then that's contrasted about what people take for granted, how dismissive the caste system is in India, and how they cater to outside opinions rather than dealing with internal perspectives.
Sounds pretty good. Anyone have any questions or feedback you'd like to give Mutendei on historical representation before we go on to his next segment, character development?
Okay, I would just mention yeah, sincere, yeah. I would just mention that the beginning of the workshop is quite interesting because there's a part of history there that you mentioned which is like similar to the untold history of our nation and so on. What I've decided to do in my new piece is to write is a historical thriller and it's based on the mysterious chase vaults in Barbados. These were some moving coffins that there was this they called it a myth. There were a lot of skeptics and so on, but there was still truth that they did occur. But around that time, Barbados was colonized by the British. And hearing the history of Canada and America and so on is rather interesting because you all have in some way let's say a twofold kind of a society that is impacted by colonialism and these kind of things and obviously and black rights and we also have the Indians that are here about very much in Canada but in the Caribbean we have a racism that after post-colonialism and post-colonialism era it doesn't really show like we don't have those bold people in our country that would give a racist comment or anything like that but yet still the whites you'll find that the whites and I would say they have a stamp within our nation because you have whites who are Barbadians. The first Barbadians were whites. If you understand what I'm saying, and they took their trade even to the South Carolinas and so on, and and there was one called Lynch that is actually said that he was responsible for this lynching and so on. So I decided to write this history of Barbados that is untold, to me, and from listening to you moments ago, I found that it's very interesting to the way how you see history and its impact on novel writing and so on. So it's very enlightening. Just had to mention that to you, the actual impact of racism and colonialism on the impact that it has on our societies and the atmosphere of it in our countries is in some way different to yours, but yours still helps us. The actual revolution of people standing up for these against this discrimination, we actually watch it from here, and the more blacks or persons that are whether black or Indian, oppose these past atrocities. We then feel a bit, be more secure, or at least we have a little help here because we are small in the States, really, we get the last of everything. The last to be released from slavery and all this kind of stuff like that. So it'd be a total different understanding of what racism and so on is in these parts. So just had to mention that.
Thanks for sharing that. Definitely
appreciate.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
Ms. James.
Yes, thank you so much, Mutendei. Very interesting presentation. Just I was just thinking of what you said, starting in your own backyard. And I'm from Trinidad and Tobago originally, even though I live in Toronto. I had this idea of doing a historical fiction, just trying that type of writing.
Yes.
And I don't even know how to start to get historical information that's not in the history books.
Okay.
Where would we start to just to find information? So that's just puzzling. And you probably wouldn't have the answer for Trinidad, but I just wanted some ideas.
Okay, so I may not have the answer for Trinidad, but I can definitely make some suggestions.
Yes.
So the first thing is to separate the story you're doing. Are you doing a fantasy mythology story, or are you doing a history story based on factualization?
Based on fact. So my father died 10 years ago.
Okay.
And he grew up in an area in the south of Trinidad that doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
But it was quite a significant industrial area back in the 20s, for petroleum and there's a big pitch lake there and all that. So, but that area doesn't exist anymore. So, but I want to revive knowledge of the area by writing a history and putting him in the story, a fictional history, but reviving knowledge of this area.
Okay, so my recommendation, and this is just a recommendation, it's not the only method you can use, is to have a documentary approach. Okay, so you mentioned there was a lot of industries within the area.
Yes.
So with any industry and any city development, there must be urban planning. So you may be able to visit an urban planning office and get records about the construction, who was involved, the different periods of the construction, and what type of cultures existed at that particular moment. For example, if you look at African railways in Uganda and so on, they were built by Indian workers. I wouldn't necessarily call them slaves as such, but it was basically economic exploitation, right? They were brought over to work, just the way some Chinese were brought to America, right? And then they developed their own history within that area. So that can be one way to approach it. You can also then approach relatives, see if he kept a diary, what was his involvement in the community. Yeah.
That's great. All right, guys, I want to stick to the program so we can keep this thing moving, flowing. Thanks for your questions and your responses so far.